The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, and Everything is Fucked. Mark Manson's phenomenally successful self-help books, published in 2016 and 2019 respectively, have become incredible successes as of late, selling millions of copies. I've read both, and I'd like to say that I don't think they're all that. Before we start on the books, let's start on the author himself. Mark Manson is perhaps the poster child for redemption. A man who started out as one of those seedy pickup artists, you know, the ones that tell you to play the game as a man and get with women with stuff like negging. He went on to publish The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck in 2016 and went from bad boy to likable self-help guy in no time, starting a publishing revolution. I mean, just think of the amount of books that have the stylized fuck on the cover now. Unfuck your brain, fuck depression, fuck everything. Self-help books took Mark's rather catchy title and tried to bank off of it, as so often happens in an industry that prides itself on marketability. One wonders who they think they're fooling though, and surely a child asking his mother what the F*** means is worse than the child just seeing the word fuck. Questionable ethics of the publishing world aside though, how is The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck? Well, in my opinion, not great. Despite having a really catchy title, it's a pretty thin book all told. The main premise Mark has here is that we need to choose what we give a fuck about. We are in control of our emotions and our destiny. Now, this isn't such a bad premise, but it's one that can be seen almost everywhere. Most of the information Mark provides is not actually very useful or unique. The man just seems to be spouting stuff that can be found on about 100,000 other self-help blogs. It's just connected with his vague anecdotes about his life. The main problem here is that The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck is entirely anecdotal. There's no real studies to back up Mark's claims. So all we have here is a lot of his opinions presented in the form of a book. And it's really thin. Despite the chunks of pages we have here, a lot of this can just be said in fewer words than Mark uses. He likes to reiterate his points again and again, to the point that you can read the first line of every paragraph and skip the rest of the book. The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck is what I like to call an if-then self-help book. Namely, if you agree with Mark Manson's views, then you will agree with most of what he says in this book. If you don't, you won't. It's really that simple. It's the kind of book you read and either nod sagely and say he's right, or you shake your head and think, what the hell is this guy talking about? It's the kind of book that I certainly wouldn't recommend to anyone with a diagnosed mental health condition. Now, Mark's stated goal of writing this book was to write the anti-self-help book, to tell people that they weren't special, that being told you're special all the time and thinking positive is not the way to a happier, better you. And while I agree with this premise, not every self-help book is like that. And the best ones, the ones that are written by psychiatrists or backed up by clever studies, understand this. They don't just tell you you're special, they tell you stuff that you need to know, and everything that you need to know is backed up by solid research. In the end, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck really didn't do it for me at all. It's not going to change minds. It's too thin to be really any use, and the only way you'll enjoy it is if you agree with all of Mark Manson's views in the book. From The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck to Everything is Fucked, published in 2019. We continue to look at Mark Manson's rise from bad boy to good guy with this 2019 book about hope. Here Mark argues that the world is essentially fucked, but that's okay. He says that hope is built on nihilism, understanding that things may not be great, but that's actually fine. Things don't have to be okay for you to be okay. The world can be as fucked as it is, but you can still have hope, and you can still have belief in something and a community to hold on to. Now, I think one lesson that Mark learned from The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck is to include more research studies, and he does that in spades here, although at one point the guy does cite himself, which I think is a bit funny, but a little bit self-congratulatory. So he's got the research now. He's got the studies to back up his claims. He's got little anecdotes to tie things together. But that's where the real problem lies. Nothing ties together. I think he had a bit of a premise when he started up Everything is Fucked, but he couldn't really tie that premise together. What we're left with is a book full of anecdotes, research studies, and bits about Mark's life again, loosely tied together by the premise that it's a bit fucked up, but we should be okay anyway if we find purpose in life. A purpose that we get from belief in something and a community. This purpose will give us hope for the future, no matter how fucked things seem to be. And while I sort of agree with the premise of Everything is Fucked, I think we have the same problem here as in Mark Manson's first book. If you agree with what he's saying, you'll nod along. If not, you'll probably throw the book aside without finishing it. And therein lies the big problem with Mark Manson's work, his style. As you'd expect with his provocative titles, Mark Manson has a very specific style of writing. It's not a bad style by any means, but it is brusque and very bro-like. In fact, I find it kind of grating. Things that are supposed to be funny just aren't. And I know it's very hard to critique comedy, since what you think is funny and what I think is funny can be different. But the way he writes and the way he inserts jokes just doesn't work for me. It falls flat more often than not. And what we end up with is a book wherein I just think I won't like the author very much, just because of his style of writing. I think he wouldn't be the kind of guy I'd like to have a beer with. And I think that's a really bad thing to have, especially when you're reading a self-help book where you're supposed to actually agree with the author's view. Now, this isn't Mark's fault. I'm sure he's a very nice guy. But again, we go back to my main point. If you don't agree with what Mark Manson is saying, he's not going to change your mind. While I think his rise from pickup artist to self-help author is very admirable, and I really admire his success and wish him the best for it, I do wish he'd get a lot better at writing books. But then again, I think he's writing to a very specific audience, and that audience is lapping up his work. And that's cool for him, really. I enjoy the fact that someone out there is having a lot of success. But I don't think a lot of people are going to find much use out of Mark's books, especially those with diagnosed mental health disorders. Now, those kind of people are going to read this kind of stuff and just it won't work for them at all, because this is written for people who do not have those kind of disorders. What do I mean by this? Well, in The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, Mark says that we are in control of how we react to situations. And while this may be true to a large extent, it's not always the case with those of us suffering from mental health conditions. As you may or may not know, mental health conditions can really screw up your perception of reality. Things can seem completely different. People with depression, anxiety disorders, and other such mental health conditions can see the world in a completely different way from those who do not have such conditions. This leads to, among other things, an inability to see the world as it is, and an inability to really control your emotions. So again, if you like Mark Manson, I don't think I'm really going to change your mind. But if you're wary and on the fence about buying these works, I wouldn't suggest it. And if you do have a diagnosed mental health condition, you really should look elsewhere for good self-help books. I would suggest stuff like Factfulness, which is actually similar in premise to Mark's Everything is Fucked, but a lot better written and a lot more comprehensive. So in the end, I like Mark Manson for what he's done, how he's gone from pickup artist to self-help author, and how he's certainly helping the people that comprises his audience. But I wouldn't suggest reading his books like I have, because I found it a real slog to get through. And by the end of it, I don't think I'm on the Mark Manson train.